Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for our final keynote. I'm very proud to introduce to you GOJKO, and I already heard several presentations who were referring to some of his books. So if you write a book and if you're getting quoted, that's what we heard from last year's keynote, then certainly in academia, you're an important guy, but I'm sure you're going to love what GOJKO is going to have to say about maximum impact with the minimum effort.
Thank you. So it's been a long day, and I know you're kind of waiting to go home. I'll try to make this short and punchy. Lots of people today have talked about how and why projects fail. And especially Paul has done a wonderful talk, and I think the number you mentioned is something like 70% of projects missing business goals and things like that. So there's lots and lots of reasons why things like that happen, but I want to try and, rather than scare you, give you a potential solution. And I'd like to give you a technique I started using about 10 years ago after I got a massive slap in the face. I was a CTO of a startup that went horribly bankrupt. And that was a really wake-up call for me, because at that time we were doing continuous delivery before continuous delivery was a buzzword. We had 100% test automation. We had wonderful technology, and then we still went bankrupt. And I kind of didn't have enough money to pay the rent next month, and I really had to admit to myself that if it was so good as I was thinking that we were good, we probably would have made money. And I started researching kind of how to, avoid ever kind of facing the same problem in the future. And then I realized lots of other companies have the same problem. And since I started researching that, I kind of stumbled upon this method called impact mapping that I want to talk to you about today. And I started talking about that a lot more at conferences, started popularizing that. And, fast forward 10 years later, I'm now writing another book about it. And I'm interviewing companies on how they've adopted this method and what benefits they got. And I'm hearing some wonderful stories. For example, there was a US government agency where they've they have brought back to life a project that was horribly late, and they were able to restructure it and deliver it about 2 years before kind of they expected to deliver it in a restarted way. I spoke to a company that was delivering some software to figure out how to rebuild a city destroyed after an earthquake. And they were originally going to spend, I don't know how many tens of millions of euros on building this geoinformation system that combines all sorts of data sources with all sorts of other data sources and some machine learning to plan some stuff. And after doing impact mapping, they realized what they actually need to do is build a slightly better calendar. And they delivered it a year before anybody expected it to be delivered. So it was a lot more beneficial, and they saved 10 times more money than they expected to save. And kind of stories like that. So I think a lot of the talk in the agile industry today is around scaling. And that seems to be kind of the next big point. Everybody wants to scale stuff up. But usually when people talk about scaling, they talk about spending more money. That's the kind of scaling they talk about, and that really scares me. I was working with a bank a couple of years ago as a consultant, and one of the kind of directors of the part of the bank I was working with wanted to kind of scale it up and, adopt agile to improve and things like that. And kind of, we tried to ask him a very simple question, like, what do you want to achieve with that? Why on earth would you want to be agile? How would you measure that you achieved it and things like that? He said, well, kind of, I don't know, we do better. But what does that mean? And I've done probably one of the stupidest mistakes in my consulting career, where I've put a director of a large part of a bank in a position where it was clear he doesn't know the answer. So we kind of postponed the meeting, and we met up again a week later and said, well, how would you know that you've succeeded in this? Well, last year we've done 35 million pounds of change. Next year we're going to do 70 million pounds of change. I said, okay, there's a number, it's financial, but what does that mean? How do you measure change? And then I've done the same mistake again, because I've put a director of a large bank in a situation where he doesn't know the answer. So a week later we met again, and it turns out that a change is how much virtual money the rest of the bank is paying his department for salaries and operational cost. So I said, okay, so if I understand this correctly, last year without doing Agile, you've done 35 million pounds of salaries and operational cost. Next year, after you do Agile, you're going to do 70 million pounds of salaries and operational costs. I said, I have a solution for you. Pay me 35 million pounds. I will walk away now. You can say you're Agile. You've achieved what you want. You don't have to change anything. It's all brilliant. So unfortunately, he didn't take me seriously. So we lost that contract. But stuff like this happens all the time, and the more we talk about scaling Agile, the more kind of people just send money down the drain. There's a lovely case study. I strongly recommend everybody investigate that a bit. It's about the BBC project for personalization in the UK that happened 2 years ago. It was cancelled after spending 75 million pounds. And after spending 75 million pounds in a public company, somebody had to investigate what happened. So the UK National Audit Office investigated how on earth can somebody spend 75 million on IT without delivering any value. And the conclusion was brilliant. The conclusion was that they could because it was Agile. So because it was Agile, the managers could make up the benefits to justify whatever they wanted to justify as they went along. So they kind of scaled it up amazingly. You kind of spend 75 million and then figure out, well, what are we doing? So I think kind of, you've heard lots of data, how projects fail and things like that. And lots of it people talk about is, technical, or you need to do this kind of testing, you need to do that kind of testing. I think the reasons for that are a lot more kind of psychological. And I think, those kind of numbers are going to stay the same, but what we can do is deal with that in a better way. And the first big problem that I think is really causing stuff like this is that there's a wrong belief in the Agile community today that whatever customers request is what they actually need. And we're getting more and more into this kind of taxi driver thing where, the customer is supposed to tell us what they want, and then we go and build it, and then, well, it's their responsibility if it's wrong. But customers are not people who know how to specify what they want. That's not their job. That was never their job. One of my favorite IT books is What Customers Want by Anthony Ulrich, who kind of, completely destroys the myth that customers can express what they want. And kind of, 20 years ago when people were doing these really big projects and stuff like that, there was lots of analysis and things like that. Somebody was trying to figure out what customers want. And suddenly kind of, okay, we've thrown that away, but we got into this position where, we just go and implement whatever people tell us they do and we declare it valuable. And that's how we get into this whole BBC thing. So please, please, please don't scale Agile like that. That's not how you scale it up. Second big problem there is that I think in software, especially kind of the larger the organization is, the importance of a feature is generally proportional to the salary of the person asking for it. And again, why? I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. There was a lovely story from Google, and you can kind of find this on Google if you Google for 40 Shades of Blue, where the head of the design at Google wanted to change the colors of the links on the homepage, and developers kind of challenged that a bit, and instead of just deploying his color, deployed 39 other colors of blue, and tested, which one is actually kind of giving them more money or not. And the kind of, as a result of that, Doug, who was the head of design back then, depending on whose side of story you read, either quit or he was fired. And he wrote a really angry blog post how you cannot do good design at Google. And there was a conference a bit later in the UK where people from Google presented how they do design. And there was a question in the audience, well, you know, Doug said you can't do good design at Google because nobody trusts you and stuff. And the presenter pulls out the data. And it's kind of so nice because you can find both sides of the story. And actually, I'll send the organizers the links to these things so you don't even have to Google. They can send you that. And it turns out that his caller was performing $250 million worse than the current caller. He was an expert. I mean, he's not, you know, somebody who is stupid. He rose through the ranks to become the head of design at Google. He just made a bad call. And the fact that, you know, somebody important asked for a feature doesn't actually mean it's valuable. It might be pointless. It might be important. It's really, really difficult to kind of know these things up front. In fact, there was a research at Microsoft to measure how many of the features they experiment on deliver actual value. And you can download this paper if you Google for online experimentation at Microsoft. Again, I'll send the organizers the link. The data from the paper says that at Microsoft, only about 1/3 of ideas moved the numbers they were supposed to move in the right direction. About 1/3 create no statistically relevant movement, and about 1/3 damage the numbers they were supposed to improve. And they quote data from Amazon, where Amazon is apparently the best in class in the industry now, where the success rate at Amazon is slightly below 50%. Now think about this. Let's say that your business people, your experts are much, much better than Microsoft's, which, you know, but let's say they are. But they're not somewhere between Microsoft and Google. What that means is that about 1/2 to 2/3 of the things you worked on last year were bad ideas. Or, more importantly, because last year's already gone, about 1/2 to 2/3 of the things you're going to work in the next year are bad ideas. Now, rather than scaling Agile by hiring 3 times more people and doing Spotify model, even if you don't have any Swedish people working for you and things like that, how about figuring out which ideas are bad and not doing them? And doing that on a shorter time scale. Now, the big question is, why are we so bad at doing this? And that's kind of a major problem here. And this is where the third big psychological problem that we're constantly facing comes in, is we are really, really not good at estimating the value of a feature. As an industry, we're not good. Our experts are not good at doing that. We tend to equate how difficult something is to build to how valuable it is. Like big projects are more valuable, small stuff is kind of, you know, not that valuable. I'm currently building a collaboration tool with a colleague, and we were going through this milestone where we wanted to become number 2 at US universities. And we were building up lots of features for this. One of the things was to integrate better with the Google Drive ecosystem, because lots of US universities are using Google Drive. Now, we built a ton of features, and we got an angry email from a university admin with lots of expletives and, you know, mentioning my mother and a dog in the same sentence and things like that. And he's kind of, you know, complaining about our software sending him a ton of emails. He received 700 emails from us the other day. And he's like, well, I apologized and I said, look, you know, I see you're angry, but it can't be us because our software has no email sending functionality. We don't send emails, like, so it must be somebody else. You know, there's several other tools that are called similar. He said, no, it's you. And he sent me a screenshot of an email, his email software, where you can see like a ton of emails with the same subject. And one of them is in focus and there's our logo on it. I said, oh, shit. So we started investigating what's going on. And, you know, in how Google Drive integration works for most applications is a user says, I would like to save to Google Drive. The app asks for permissions, and the dialog pops up from Google saying this application would like to access your Google Drive. Yes or no? You say yes, the dialog goes away, the app has access. Not at his university. At his university, a student says, I would like to save to Google Drive. A dialog pops up. A student says yes, and then the admin gets an email saying this student would like this app to kind of save to his Google Drive, yes or no. And this was a an interesting thing because at an online course in his university, one of the teachers recommended us because we were building all these features, and 700 students wanted to access our app. So he got 700 emails. Now, at this point, we again apologized, said we can't do anything about that. He said, no. For several other apps, I have a bulk approve. For you, I don't. And then I started investigating this, and I found that on page number 3 of configuring the Google Drive app, there's a tiny checkbox. If you check it, the admins can bulk approve. But bulk approving does not exist, actually. What it does is, people at Google probably had this problem with other applications, so they did a pre-install to all my students button. And they called it bulk approve. Which means that, when he clicked that button, he didn't just approve it for the 700 students asking for it, he installed it to all his students. And it turns out lots of other universities were having a similar problem, just not at that scale, so they didn't complain. But that teeny tiny checkbox actually did more for us than about 3 months of development. Because after enabling that, pretty much, the first time a student asked for something at a similar setup, an admin will install it to all the students, and you can see the kind of engagement rates rising like this. So if somebody asked me before that, like, is this checkbox more valuable than all these other features you're building, I'd say, no, you're crazy. But it turns out it was. And so I think, as an industry, we're not really that good at estimating the values of features. And those 3 things are creating really, really big problems for us. But they're not particularly tied to IT. There's a lovely book called Adapt by a British economist, Tim Harford, who wrote about why plans like this fail in civil engineering, in military, in government planning, in economics, and how they're suffering from the same problems as we do. And it presents a couple of solutions there. It says plans fail because even with the best intentions of your experts, they occasionally make bad calls. They make bad calls based on trying to extrapolate their knowledge about one thing to another thing where it doesn't completely translate. It says there's at least 3 dimensions that are causing these things to happen. One thing is that we try to take knowledge from one locality or one platform or one way of applying our ideas and take it somewhere else, like from desktop to mobile or from mobile to the text messages, or from we try to apply our knowledge and we make silly assumptions about that without knowing how this is going to work out. Or this might be a physical locality. I had a client who had some really good credit algorithms in the Nordics. They deployed to Russia and lost a lot of money. People behave differently. But without knowing that, without trying it out, we don't know. Even the experts can't make good calls. The other dimension he talks about is time, where as we deliver, business opportunities open up or close. We start working and something interesting happens in the market. A competitor does something invalidating part of the plan. Or a business opportunity opens up because now, a big company is promoting the same idea or something like that. And we should be able to benefit from that rather than hurting our plans. And the last dimension he talks about is human, how effectively humans are unpredictable. They tell us they want one thing, they do something completely differently. We expect them to behave rationally, but they don't. And all of these things create problems that, that's why our domain experts, our business experts make bad calls. But the bad news is, as I said, statistically between half and 2/3 of the things in your backlog are bad ideas. The good news is all your competitors are suffering from the same problem. So if we can figure these things out faster, what Hartford says is we can not only survive when these things surprise us, we can actually benefit from that. If we can find these things and react to them faster, we can benefit from that stuff. And that's what companies like Google know how to do, because they know how to figure this thing out and measure it and see if something unexpected happened. So what Hartford is talking about, how in order to benefit from that, our plans need to have 3 components. And he calls these 3 components Palczynski principles, based on this Russian engineer Pyotr Palczynski, who invented lean startup about 150 years ago. and got killed by the KGB for that. So it's a really, really interesting life story to kind of look at it. He was erased from Soviet history by Stalin, actually. But that's for a completely different presentation. So Harford says that in order to benefit when something unexpected happens, our plans need to have three components. The first component is variation. What that means is we really have no idea what's going to work, what's not going to work. So we need to have plans that have lots of things that might work or might not work. Our plans need to have more than the minimum we plan to deliver. Because we need to have options that, based on these unexpected things, if something unexpected happens, we have prepared options to jump to something else. Most people do the minimum they plan to deliver in the plan, and then they argue how they have too much work anyway. So we need to have more options in the plan. The second thing he talks about is how good plans need to have survivability. If any of these options turns out to be a bad idea, that should not completely kill the project. You shouldn't have to spend 75 million to understand that something went wrong. But so in terms of that, having options, well, beer or vodka, or, beer in Belgium probably is, you can create lots of options very easily. Survivability, we're kind of better than we were 20 years ago. We know how to create smaller stories. It's the third principle that really messes things up in our industry, and this is selection. When Harford talks about selection, he's not talking about selection in terms of selecting what we want to do next, not prioritization. He's more talking about it in an evolutionary selection thing. What should we keep? How do we know that this was a good idea? And this is where most teams do stuff really, really, really badly. That's the one we're missing. There was a lovely case study from the FBI of the Sentinel Project 3 build. It was written up about 2 years ago in IEEE and then started making its way into the books. You're very, very likely to read a lot more on this in books that are kind of coming out soon. And it goes something like this. Somewhere, 15 years ago or something like that, the FBI's main case management system was still in COBOL. And because most COBOL programmers are either dead or retired, they decided to rewrite it, of course. And, they're going to rewrite it in, Java or something like that. And the way FBI does these things is they list all the features of the old system. They publish it on a kind of request for proposals. And Lockheed Martin won the bid with $90 million as an offer. $90 million later, they realized that it's never going to be finished. There's too many wrong things with it. It's not going according to the schedule. But Lockheed Martin had really good lawyers, and they had to pay the whole thing and just cancel it. And they decided they still have this COBOL problem. They have $90 million less, but hey, they need to do something about it. So what they decided to do is they're going to be smarter. And this time, they wanted to be able to cancel the project every month. So every month, whoever wins the contract is supposed to present what they did, and then FBI will say yes, no, cancel, And somebody else won the contract, and $360 million later, they realized it's never going to come together, it's never going to be finished, there's too many big problems with it. And the big question was, why did it take 4 times more money to learn this in an iterative way? How is it possible that, they doing this thing in an not really agile, but an iterative way, it takes 4 times more money to spot it's not going okay? And they had a similar conclusion to kind of what the BBC did because it was agile. As every month they could justify whatever they did as, valuable. And one of the things that Jerome Israel, who wrote up this paper called Why FBI Cannot Build a Case Management System, concluded is the only metrics they had were metrics of effort. They were misleading people. They had metrics around functional points delivered. They had functions delivered. They were measuring screens and things like that. That's all how much money you've burnt building your project. That's not what you got out of it. And it's not verifying that any of that was a good idea. And that was his big conclusion, how we need a completely different set of metrics. We need a selection criteria for this to know if it was a good idea or not. So this is where lots of these things come together, and there's a kind of, if you start looking at how we're doing plans now, most people have plans like this. That's horrible. The font is intentionally small. Don't even try to read it. It's horrible. It's kind of a bunch of these things that have to be done where it's all as a blah blah in order to blah 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 blah, and it's all horrible because there is no selection criteria on any of this. Yes, there's a lot of variation and they're all survivable, but how do we know if this thing was a good idea or not after we deliver? And this is where kind of if people start talking about roadmaps, we can look at, well, these are roadmaps that are useful. The hint is in the name, it's a map of roads. This is potentially a single road going through a tunnel where you're going on one end, you're out 9 months later, and it's like, am I in Belgium at all? Am I, where? And so with roadmaps like this, we have variation. We have more roads than we will ever take. On a roadmap like this, having roads that you never take is perfectly fine. They're still useful because if something's blocked, you have another option. With roadmaps like this, where kind of, with roadmaps like this, they're all kind of survivable. We can move around, if this thing here is blocked, I'm going to go there, I can go over there. But how we use roadmaps like this changed quite significantly over the last 10 or 15 years. So I have a confession to make. I've never learned how to drive. I'm too stupid to do that. So I don't have a driving license. And usually what that means is I was on the seat next to the driver playing TomTom before TomTom was TomTom. And I'd be the one, flipping the pages of a book when my wife drives. And what used to happen 12, 13 years ago, we would have to plan the journey in lots of details, especially if we're going somewhere unknown. And, mark up all the streets where we need to go. And then I would try flipping the book as she drives. And then about 15 minutes later or half an hour later, we would end up in a discussion who has the reflexes of a dead horse, who is blind, who doesn't know, how to read and things like that. Because anything that happens unusual completely derails the whole plan. A single bad turn completely invalidates the whole plan. And replanning is very expensive. Especially, if you don't know where you are. And so about 15 years ago, we bought a marriage-saving device. So if you have problems in your marriage, just buy one of these. It's amazing because it removes the whole problem of, somebody being a moron or not knowing how to read and and even if, somebody has the reflexes of a dead horse so they can't make a turn, it's not a big problem. This is going to replan automatically. Replanning became cheap. Now, replanning became cheap because we got turn-by-turn navigation here. We got a selection criteria. We got something that will automatically decide if we made the next turn, and if not, it's going to offer options to correct it. But we got operational awareness around have we made the next turn. Now, in a lovely book called 4 Disciplines of Execution, I strongly recommend everybody reads, they talk about how most projects, not software, but most projects end up failing because people don't have operational awareness like that. Because success metrics or failure metrics are tied to long-term stuff like revenue, profit, market share, which is all brilliant, but is not helpful to plan next week. Stuff I do now might generate revenue 6 months from now or a year from now. Like, by the time I figure if it's making money or not, it's already too late. It's in the software, and I've built 5 million other features in the software, and it's really difficult to know which one is good, which one is bad. So we need shorter-term metrics that can tell us whether we go in the right direction or not. It's good to have, my destination is somewhere in Germany, but it's also nice to have turn-by-turn navigation to tell us whether we're going okay or not. And they suggest that turn-by-turn navigation, there's a couple of models for that. One of the models they suggest is behavior change. Changing the behavior of our users, stakeholders, is a good way to know if we're going the right direction. That's what people at Google did. Are people clicking on more links or not? Are we changing the behavior? We don't have to measure the money now. We can measure whether people are clicking on more links. So how are we changing their behavior? So what they've concluded is that behavior change is potentially valuable. That's how we can measure value on a shorter time cycle, something that gives us a good indicator of, are we going the right direction? So we can use this to try and see how would we create a GPS for our software. And what that allows us to do is start to create hierarchical plans, where we have these big business goals, market share, revenue, customer satisfaction, opening a new channel, conquering the world and things like that. And they're good as guiding vision. But they're not good to tell us if what we're doing is a good idea or not on a shorter time scale, something where we can benefit from replanning. And Forrester Research did this brilliant paper a couple of years ago. They surveyed how companies actually adopt Agile. And their conclusion is that by far the most popular Agile process out there is water, scrum, fall. So, make all the decisions now, then do something for months and months and months, and then figure out what happened and potentially test it for a couple of months and then go live. There's zero benefit for an organization that people can do stuff in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because if something unexpected happens in the middle, like a market opportunity opens or closes, we cannot change our plans. That's the equivalent of driving with a big paper map. But if we start putting something in between our deliverables and the goals, turn-by-turn navigation, using behavior change, then we can create proper roadmaps where we can put GPS in and we can measure what's going on. And this is what impact mapping is trying to do. Impact mapping is a visualization where we connect business goals through people whose behavior we're changing and how we're changing their behavior to deliverables we're trying to achieve, which allows us to set up a whole sequence of visualizations around assumptions and say, well, if I do better pagination, I expect that these people will view more ads. I can measure that on a shorter time cycle. Even more importantly, I can say, well, how much more ads do they need to view so this is valuable? So you can start looking at whether this is going in the right direction or not. And this allows us to create roadmaps for relatively large projects where we can establish a sequence of things to measure and measure whether we're going in the right direction. This US government agency I mentioned, one of the key things they wanted to do is figure out how do we help our caseworkers process more cases per day. And they had this number of cases per day that was something on a shorter time scale they could measure. So you do a bit of software, you measure, can people process more cases per day? You bit more software, you measure that, you display that, you show it to the stakeholders. And then every 2 weeks they had a voting session like, okay, we've done this stuff over here, we've moved this number this much. Should we keep working on this area or should we move to another area? And then they measured it going from 77 to 79 to 80 to 81. And then it stopped around 89 or something like that. And decided, okay, we've done as much as we can over here. We've tried for a couple of weeks, we couldn't move that number. Let's do something else. So impact mapping is for me, one of the best ways to bridge this whole thing between deliverables and features and all of the stuff that developers love to work on, and this other stuff over here that is in PowerPoints, where usually the gap between is so wide that nobody even knows how to start solving it. And as a visualization technique, it's very, very lightweight. I worked with a big investment bank where usually it takes them a few weeks with senior stakeholders in the room to figure out the plan for the next milestone. After starting to chart it with impact maps, we were able to figure out, cut that down to maybe 2 or 3 days per milestone, saving an enormous amount of time because it's just visual and we can put stuff there. And by doing this stuff, people usually figure out how to cut scope down significantly. I'll leave you with a story from a tax office I interviewed. All this data is going to be in the new book. We still didn't get permission to publish people's names, so I can't tell you the currency. Otherwise, it I'll give away too much. But what they were going to do is they were going to build this artificial intelligence system. Of course, everybody's building artificial intelligence systems today to spot fraud. And it's going to help them save, I don't know how many millions of euro equivalents and stuff like that. And after going through this and starting to build that and measuring where they go, they very quickly decided that if they actually wanted to achieve this, they shouldn't build artificial intelligence to spot fraud. They should build something that is really dumb and just eliminates where absolutely there is no fraud, so that humans can actually focus on investigating fraud faster. And as a result of that, they've delivered maybe 5% of the original scope, but they saved 10 times more money than expected. They've delivered a huge impact with minimum amount of effort required. And that's what a GPS for our project can give us. So that's pretty much it. I'm slightly running out of time. I think you wanted to finish in 1 minute and 11 seconds. So kind of check out impactmapping.org, has a lot more information about this stuff. And I'll send the organizers an email with all the papers I've mentioned and all the books I've mentioned, so you can kind of read up on that. Hopefully this inspires you to start creating a GPS for your projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, GOJKO.
Thank you.
GOJKO.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me see.